All right. Good morning. Welcome to Classical Education 101. Glad to have you guys in here and glad to have everybody online participating. I got to give a shout out to El Paso Classical. Hey guys, good to see you. We're having a great time here and hopefully you guys are having a great time over there as well. I am Jason Poarch. I'm the headmaster at El Paso Classical. We just opened up last year. We're a full K-12 school. And hopefully on track to become a Founders Classical in a couple of years. We'll see how that goes. I just gave you a handout. Actually, Dr. Nason, I didn't give you a handout. I'm sorry about that. Oh, great. Yeah. I did get most of them already. Yeah. Oh, there you go. Good. Dr. Moore. It's nice to have you guys in here. There's a small enough crowd in the room here that I just went ahead and handed out some handouts of the presentation. And then for anybody online, you're welcome to email me. Trying to think of how you would email me. I would put it in the chat, but I can't right now. It is jpoarch@responsived. Just look up Jason Poarch and it'll populate in your email. I can share this document with you. Actually, all of the presenters at this conference are uploading slides and notes, etc., onto a drive that should be accessible to all of you in time. So keep that in the back of your head as you move through this conference. You know, it's really an honor to be here and to be a part of a conversation like this, right? We're not only participating in a great conversation called classical education, not to be confused with classical conversations, but that's where the idea comes from, right? We're participating in a great conversation, and it's a very long and a very deep conversation called classical education. And one thing I really enjoy about conferences like this is that they start to raise questions, they start to raise interesting discussion, right? And so one, it's an honor to come after Heather Brown, who just spoke on the moral imagination, right? We were going to have Dr. Christopher Perrin, who is just going to talk about wonder and joy in classical education. That's the mark of a good conference, though, is that you can actually start to cultivate just simply a conversation throughout these 2 days. And so take this, and I'm hoping to just simply, as just an entry-level classical education talk and a little bit of discussion with you all to just set you up and show you how this just feeds into every single other speaker here and every single school represented here and the broader mission, culture, et cetera, that we're trying to establish at Founders Classicals, Classical Academies, right? So it's really exciting, and that is kind of where we're at in this point of history. Now let's talk about this, okay? There's a few things happening in our culture today, a few things happening in our nation, and a few things happening in education right now. Okay, there's three things I would argue that are pretty instrumental in changing a lot of things and kind of trajectories in how we do education and where we're trying to send people. So first, the CLT, second, honors programs, and then third, space travel. And you're wondering about space travel. We'll talk about it in a moment. Not CRT, okay? In fact, potentially the exact opposite, right? CLT, the classic learning test. That is a new standardized test for college entrance. How many in this room know about the CLT? I'm just curious. Okay, a handful of you. Good. Actually, the majority of you don't know about it. And so that's helpful. CLT, the classic learning test, look it up when you get home or on a break or whatever. Don't do it right now. It's basically starting to replace the SAT and the ACT as a standardized college entrance exam. And I don't know of a notable Christian college in the nation that hasn't accepted it as either a substitute or just simply as an entrance evaluator. But I also don't know of a very high-profile school that also hasn't accepted it, whether it be private or beyond that. 5 years ago, probably 12 colleges used it, and they were all classical schools. Okay, now I couldn't even tell you the number. I think at least 100, if not more. I'm pretty sure you would recognize the names of the colleges on their website, basically, and you would be kind of astounded. But this is a standardized test that's going to ask students questions using Aquinas or G.K. Chesterton or C.S. Lewis or Pascal, or really any other classical author that you might discover in an old leather-bound book in some used bookstore anywhere around Dallas, especially at half-price books. I miss half-price books. All right, so CLT, honors programs. That's the next thing. Honors programs all across the nation are popping up, and any kind of college. And there's typically two components to them. One, they're original sourced, and two, they're seminar-based. Okay? So within the broader educational community, there's a little more private entities. You have to be a little bit more elite to get into them. They're not closed off, but just they're sectioned off, and they're called honors programs, and that's what they do. So it's a full revitalization of classical education all across the nation right now. Now, that's on the college level, but that's really kind of our trajectory, and that's really one of the primary outcomes of TEA, whether it be college, career, military readiness, et cetera, right? And so that's our aim, right? We want to produce students, adults, who are able to enter into these programs. And I'm just saying, up there or out there, it's fundamentally changing institutions. And so, along with a number of other things. And space travel, that's just a brief mention to this little phenomenon that typically employers and employees are changing so rapidly that within 5 years of, say, graduating our schools, you're most likely not going to be the job that you're going to be doing for the rest of your life. In fact, you're probably going to change your job many times as the economy changes and as there are shifts in technology and all that stuff. And space travel, legitimately, right? We're starting to get out there and discovering a new world that's quite possibly on the fringe of what Christopher Columbus was 400 or 500 years ago, right? It might be a long shot, but it might not be. We might be on the verge of that much change. And so what I would submit is that classical education is one of the best educations that you can get to support life beyond, right? And enter and be successful at these areas. Now, there's a few others. I've already mentioned CC, Classical Conversations. In fact, I'm kind of curious. Does anybody know anybody in Classical Conversations in this room? Yeah, already. So a handful of hands there. And then Great Hearts is another public charter school, mainly out in Phoenix, but they're breaking into Texas as well. But all I'm saying is these guys are about classical education. So it's really exciting to be part of a broader movement, not only within responsive ed, but farther beyond, right? So now we have Founders Classicals, and we have Classical Academies. We have 17 campuses. We're breaking into other states. We are growing, and it really is just, are you willing to be a part and jump in? Because there's a ton of work to do, and it's very, very exciting. So here we go. What's so great about classical education? I would submit it's awesome and it'll change your life. It's awesome and it'll change your life. Pure and simple. Now, take a moment. I want you guys to just turn and find a little group around you, and I want you to ask a question and come up with a couple of answers. What is classical education? Go. Just ask each other, what exactly is classical education? See if somebody can distill it, and then I want a couple of people to stand up and tell me what they think it is. What is classical education? And you online, go ahead and do the same. All right, turn to your neighbor or a small group around you and discuss with each other. Ask each other questions. What exactly is classical education? See if you can come up with a simple idea, or what kind of embodies classical education. I'll give you like 30 more seconds here. I assume we have Tyler Classical attending online. Hi, nice to meet you. And I'm not sure who else. Sorry, I don't have chat here, but feel free to hail in chat. All right, so take a moment. Select somebody. I just want to hear from somebody over here and somebody over here. What is classical education? What would you say it is? Let's go with this side first. Classical education. What'd you guys say it is? Who's going to speak up? Yeah, go for it. Interesting. Yeah, say more. What does that mean? Like it can't reference cultural like movies, or like it only studies past historical events? What does that mean? That's very interesting. Yeah, and just simply that theme of depth, but even able to build up a child, right? Not simply some ivory tower philosopher, as it were, right? And we're starting to get into what Heather Brown was talking about, the immoral imagination, and starting to find where can we find elements that build a moral imagination, right? It's arguably only in things that are good, true, and beautiful. And where do you find good, true, and beautiful things? Typically in age-old classics. Age-old classics, typically. Otherwise, sunsets, etc. Yep. How about over here? What'd you guys come up with? Any volunteers to share? What do you think classical education is? Yeah, I like that you said that, because that's really kind of my working definition of classical education, is just simply prolonged exposure to the classics or to the good, true, and beautiful, et cetera, right? Just prolonged exposure, kind of developing a discipline to this as we move forward and as they develop, right, through various stages in life. And so here's a couple of examples or analogies. I would literally compare what we're doing to a whole foods diet, and what most education out there is a fast foods diet, frankly, okay? And if you've ever been on a whole foods diet, one, it hurts. Two, it's hard sometimes, but man, the fruit of it is delightful, really. And at core, I would argue it's transformative. Maybe even redemptive, but transformative, right? Just like these diets are transformative. We've seen the guy who eats McDonald's for 30 days and see how his life is transformed, right? Typically toward the worse, right? And then if we get on a whole foods diet, our life is typically transformed as well toward the better. But frankly, that's what we're doing. We are feeding not our bodies only, but our souls whole foods. Things that are very, very important to all of life, and to virtue and the intellect, et cetera, right? So whole foods diet. And this one, mountains. I know in Texas you don't have mountains, okay? But there are a thing called mountains. And if you go to Colorado, they're really, really cool. They're up there. Or keep going and you'll get even better ones. right? But walking out into, say, the Johnson grasslands, there's some beauty there, okay? But drive up to Colorado, and you're going to be awestruck. Right? This is what classical education is. It's awestruck, right? You behold what is good, what is true, and what is beautiful in much the same way as the difference between seeing a hill in Texas and a snow-capped mountain range with evergreens, whole pines, tree lines even. You don't have tree lines here in Texas, but it's a thing, right? You go above tree line and it's phenomenal. Right? But that's where you start to go with classical education. You actually, even Nietzsche talks about good education where you walk out, you climb up into the mountains, right? And you behold things holistically, you behold great things, timeless things, etc. Right? And that's really here's kind of some quick 10 sellers for classical education, okay? 1, it's real content. 2, it's timeless. 3, multiple methods. 4, original source. It embraces all student levels. It's bottomless, not boring. It's the best minds. It reflects human nature, teaches how to think, not what to think. It changes lives, and it's universal, right? These are huge elements to education. And if I were hearing about an education that actually does this for my children, I would probably sign up right away, right? It's pretty nice. It's a nice little sales pitch of what exactly are we about here. But we're just scratching the surface here. These things are all true, and we can provide tons of data points to support these things. But it really changes lives. It's fundamentally transformative when you experience classical education. So now let's move into really the core of my talk, 5 questions, 5 central questions to a basic understanding of classical education. This is trying to take. So there's a lot of different brands of classical education out there, just so you know, but there are a lot of universals about it, and so I'm going to try to ask in the form of questions 5 central questions that cultivate what exactly is it that we're after, but it's really, it's 101 level, right? We're beginning to just cultivate the conversation. We're in the sparks stage. We don't have a full-on flame or forest fire yet, okay? So 5 awesome questions. Actually, let's pause for a moment. Who wants candy? All right, it's 10 a.m. Anybody want candy here? Anybody? No? Yes, good. Here we go. Have some candy over there. Okay. Is there now that I'm starting to lose your attention? Does anybody want a Sudoku book? A Sudoku book. Am I even saying that right? Thank you, Sudoku. Yeah. Who wants it? All right, there you go. I won't be offended if you do that while I'm talking, but there you go. Have some sugar to help yourself through this morning conference. Okay, great. 5 awesome questions. First, what is classical education? And honestly, what's in the background, right? Just simply an old leather-bound book that if you walk into used bookstores, it's an immediate recognition. Even if you don't have any concept of it, you see the Harvard 5-foot bookshelf up on the top of the shelf for selling for whatever. You're like, hey, that's classical education, or that's a classic, right? It's timeless. The definition tends to be it's just survived the test of time, right? It's a notable work for what it is. Now, Christopher Perrin, since he's not here, it's kind of nice. I'm glad to introduce you. How many know this guy? How many know Christopher Perrin? Okay. How many have been to classicalu.com? Okay, all right. So go ahead and write it down. Classicalu.com, just like iTunes U or whatever, classical U, the letter U.com. It's very nice. It's sort of a Netflix, right? It's got a lot of lectures on all sorts of subjects, and lots of different professors or teachers or notable professionals talking about various different topics, all the way from math and science and special education to the classics to classical education. And you can watch Christopher Perrin's opening introductory 45-minute lecture for free just by clicking on one of the first level 1 courses and watching. It's very, very nice, okay? But this little pamphlet, the Introduction to Classical Education, a guide for parents, is really a very nice introductory guide as well, right? Here's how he defines classical education. Classical education is the authoritative, traditional, and enduring form of education begun by the Greeks and Romans, developed through history, and now being renewed and recovered in the 21st century. So here's the deal. Notice, renewed and recovered, right? Within the last 100 years at least, we've had a transformation of education, namely public education, that has changed education from what it used to be. When I describe classical education to parents who come and visit my school, or really just about anywhere, they tend to say at the end, that's interesting. You mean the way education used to be done, right? Oh, you mean like traditional education, like Little House on the Prairie education. Oh, yeah, that's it, right? Now we're back to that moral imagination part. But there's just been so many changes over the last 100 years that it's virtually unrecognizable. And so what he's doing and how he's defining this is it's being renewed and recovered. Renewed and recovered, right? Now notice, underlined there, Greeks and Romans, okay? That's what we call the Greco-Roman tradition. Raise your hand if you've heard that term before. Greco-Roman, good, okay. All right, and then there's another tradition that would be kind of but also alongside it. It's called the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? So if you think about the history of Western civilization in 5 cities, moving from Jerusalem, Athens, to Rome, to London, and then to Philadelphia, right? You think about those civilizations and those historical epochs that all center and build and had major events moving through those 5 cities throughout time, the last 2,000, 25, whatever 100 years you want to talk about. That's kind of how we're going about this. But Greco-Roman, but Judeo-Christian. And when you cultivate the values of those 2 traditions, you start to get a full-fledged understanding of what we mean by classical education. Okay? You can't really escape them. So it can be historical, and our schools do lean very heavily historical, cultivating history from the earliest levels, right? We want them to have the basic knowledge as they grow up and move through the grammar school, logic, and rhetoric, those 3 kind of elementary, middle school, and high school levels that we're talking about here. Now, here's what I mentioned before, right? Based off of what you were saying there, classical education is prolonged exposure to the good, true, and beautiful. Okay. That's really kind of all it is. And if you actually start to figure out where the good, true, and beautiful is, then you're going to start cultivating very, very precise, very, very certain things in life. This little image beside it is a medieval image of the 7 liberal arts, the 7 liberal arts, okay? So we have grammar, logic, rhetoric, moving kind of in clockwise direction around it. So at the top, grammatica, rhetorica, dialectica, and then it moves into music, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy, right? So you have the 3-letter arts and the 4 numerical arts, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's just the image. It can be kind of confusing, but it's really, really cool image about what education, how it was done in medieval times, etc. Okay, here are 5 other main distinctives about classical education or prolonged exposure to the great books or prolonged exposure to the good, true, and beautiful. Okay, 5 distinctives. 1, the great books, right? We want to be centered on the great books, or rather, we are centered on the great books. 2, history, right? 3, it typically embodies the study of Greek and Latin language and culture that surrounds it, right? Greek and Latin. So whether it's in the lower school where we're talking English from the roots up, walking through Greek and Latin, right? Or if it's in middle school where they're actually studying Latin, Cambridge Latin or Wheelock or whatever, and then we're moving on to high school where they're really sometimes actually beginning to read some of the great books in the original languages, which is really, really fun. Okay? But that's what we're doing. Honestly, at most of our schools, that's happening. Okay? Because they're exposed to Latin and Greek so early on that by the time they hit early high school, they're actually able to read excerpts, if not whole books, in the original language. Character-based, virtue-based, right? This is a character-based education, and it's inescapable. When you look through books like this, your heart is going to be pushed around. All right? Your character is going to be pushed around. You're going to be challenged. Your soul is going to be pushed around. All right? It's a character-based education. It says that what you think about, like Aristotle argues, what you think about turns into your words, turns into your actions, turns into your habits, turns into your character, virtue over time. All right? So there's a little phrase or saying by Heraclitus, a man's character is his fate, or a person's character is their fate. All right? You tell me what their character is, anywhere, behind closed doors, whatever, talk about integrity, and I'll tell you what their outcome is, where they're going to go in life. Right? It's very nice. This quote, Mr. Karras over at Founders Louisville, it just makes a lot out of that little quote, a man's character is his fate, and I think it's gold. It's very, very good. And then the transcendentals, we've mentioned them a couple of times, but the good, true, and beautiful, and we'll talk about what those are, okay? So what are the transcendentals? That's our next second question. What are the transcendentals? I just mentioned them. They're the good, the true, and the beautiful. They're classically thought in a trinity pair, a trinity, and they typically are inseparable. It's very, very difficult to have one without the other, another one, if not the other two, when it truly is that thing. And so it's really, really fun. If you're talking about what is true, it's most likely what is good and most likely what is beautiful. All right? Very fun. But let's talk about the good. What is the good? So you may have heard the parable of the bee and the fly. Have you guys anybody heard the parable? A couple of you. Good. The parable of the bee and fly. I'm very, very short, very quickly. You ask a bee where all the good things in life are, and he's going to point you to the flowers and the nectar and the honey, and hopefully he won't point you, and hopefully you don't go to the honey without some protective clothing, otherwise you'll get stung. But you ask him or whatever that question, and you're going to get very particular answers. You ask a fly that same question, where are all the good things in life? And that fly is going to point you to the garbage, to the carcasses, to all the stinky things in life. Okay, so the question becomes, what are you? Are you a bee or a fly? Right? If people come to you and ask you, where are all the good things in life? Are you a bee or are you a fly? Do you know where all the good things in life are? Or do you know where all the bad things in life are? Right, the parable of the bee and fly. All right. It orients us, right? And now what is the true? What is the true? Most simply, what is false? You very quickly discover what is true, but I prefer the compass image, right? A true north, right? When you don't know the direction you're heading in, you need a compass. And it's going to point you in the right direction. And that is the true, right? What holds true in life, right? And then back to the Pinocchio example, right? If you ask Pinocchio what is true, well, I'm not really sure what your answer will get you, but it also cultivates what you're doing through those three areas, the grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the three layers of classical education done on the K-12 level. What is true is cultivated through those stages. All right. Now, what is beautiful? Okay, so first, we have a pretty easy image of a beautiful bride on a wedding day. Not much gets more beautiful than that, right? A beautiful bride on a wedding day. Now, second, put up beside that a picture of Mother Teresa or an older lady full of virtue. And then when you compare those two images, and as long as you keep the second image, you're going to start cultivating the question of what is beautiful with a capital B. Okay? There's nothing wrong with physical beauty, but typically, and this is what many of the classical authors argue, is that physical beauty is simply a reflection of something beyond the physical, right? Something more metaphysical beauty, right? Aquinas gives a very basic definition of beauty and he simply says, that which pleases upon being seen. That which pleases upon being seen. But what he means by being seen is what is envisioned and what is beheld in a metaphysical encounter. And for many classical authors, it's beholding the presence being of God, right? And so physical beauty tends to be put up against the nature of true virtue that we find in many different traditions, but true virtue is, but notice it's starting to cultivate the good and the true, right, in that. And so awakening true love and wonder. So this is classical education, right? What is the good, what is the true, and what is the beautiful? And these things are cultivated through prolonged exposure to the good, true, and beautiful, and through those different areas of the liberal arts. Now, what are the liberal arts? What are the liberal arts? I've mentioned them already, right? We're simply talking the 3-letter arts and the 4 numerical arts, okay? It's a term that's thrown around in classical education all the time. It's a liberal arts education, right? This is all we mean. It's literally referring to the 7 liberal arts. The 7 liberal arts. Now, in our schools, in our founders' classicals and in our classical academies, we tend to use the 3-letter arts to form kind of the whole structure of the whole education: grammar, middle, and high school. That's the 3. And then we infuse all along the way the math and sciences, all right, along with all the letter education, the humanities, if you will. But then we just infuse the math and sciences, the geometry, mathematics, music, and other sciences like astronomy, right, later on. So what are the liberal arts? And this is maybe just some other helpful images of what it looks like to walk through these 3 different stages. Now, I'm curious at Corinth, correct? Corinth, what do you refer to your middle school as? Middle school? Or is it the logic school? Middle school? Okay. Okay. Yes. Yep. Yep, good. Yep, yeah, that's right. Good. How about over here? What are your middle schools called? Middle school? Okay, great. Yeah. So at some places, they're going to refer to, and you'll even hear administration mention it from time to time, right? The rhetoric school or the logic school or the grammar school, that's where this comes from. Okay? It's kind of a structural approach to what you just mentioned, the trivium, right? And those are the 2 terms I haven't mentioned yet. The trivium referring to the 3 and the quadrivium referring to the 4 numerical arts, right? Most of the time, classical schools will be formed with the 3, but you're exactly right that you can do it all along the way, and in fact, it's happening all along the way. You're always being introduced to grammar. You're always being introduced to logic. You're always, hopefully, being introduced to rhetoric. So you're learning the basic building blocks, the grammar, the knowledge, and then you're beginning to make sense of them, the logic. And then you learn how to make sense of them and speak them forth beautifully. That's rhetoric. That's the trajectory of classical education, is to know, make sense, understand, and have wisdom. Have an outcome that is beautiful. That's some of the basic goals there. All right, so there is another little concept that when you read Plato's Republic, the greatest book on education, which I'll talk about in a moment, it cultivates the question of what is justice. And you're like, okay, but justice is, I thought that was political. I thought, yes, it is. But classically understood, it's a massive concept that drives virtually all of life, right? If you are just, you are living the good life, and you're beginning to cultivate and make a good character, right? You're encountering and you're living out the good, true, and beautiful. So then justice, good, true, and beautiful, and what is excellence? What is excellence? Now, let's move to our, there's another little image, right, about the trivium there versus the quadrivium, and you have the different, what I've been talking about here over the last few minutes. Prolonged exposure to the good, true, and beautiful. Now, what are the best books? What are the best books in classical education? I would submit 3 gold standards for classical education. If you haven't read them and you're a classical educator, you should read them. Doesn't mean that you'll particularly apply Plato's Republic on the kindergarten level, but you should read them. And he's going to talk about education on the kindergarten level. Okay? But if you're a classical educator, you should read Plato's Republic. It is the greatest book on education, and it's always been hailed that way throughout the great tradition of great authors throughout history, always referring back to back to Plato's Republic. I'm just checking the time. We are done at 11:15, is that correct, our time? 11:15? 10:15 we start? Yeah, good, okay. So, good. The greatest book on education, The Republic of Plato. So it's written in dialogue form. There's a number of different translations out there on Plato's Republic. I would recommend starting with Alan Bloom, but there's a handful of other good translations to read, and you can also get it on audiobooks or Audible. Any audiobooks people in here? I'm major audiobooks, yeah. So listen to it, right? But it's in dialogue form. It's kind of like a script, a screenplay or something, right? You go back and forth between different people, or what are called interlocutors, right? And so Socrates, the guy, actually that's Plato down there from the School of Athens, that big classic painting. But Socrates didn't really write anything. He was kind of like Jesus in that way. He didn't really write anything, but his disciples or the people who studied under him did write stuff down. And Plato used Socrates as his main person, kind of central figure. And then Socrates begins to work on educating and exploring what is justice and education in this book with a guy named Glaucon. And then there's a bunch of other Greek names that, no big deal, you learn them if you read them. But arguably, I would submit that this book is a book on the education of Glaucon. And it's also equally one of the greatest books on the cultivation of the question of what is justice. Okay? But you start to cultivate in this book big questions of what is justice. What does it look like? Justice in a city, or in a school, or in your classroom, or in your home. Okay? Literally those magnified levels. And then it switches in book 4 to justice in your soul. What does a well-ordered soul look like? Okay? What happens when you allow your stomach to run your life? All right? Your appetites, your passions. What happens when you only allow your mind to run your life and don't have passions, right? These sorts of things. That's a well-ordered soul, and that's what he's talking about in here. Okay, what is a well-ordered soul? And that just cultivates education. What are the good things in life? What should we be aiming at? So that's Plato's Republic. Next one I'll hit on is a little bit later. I actually don't have it with me, but it's Rousseau's Emile, or On Education. It's a similar-sized book. It's written, 1,500 years later. But Jean-Jacques Rousseau, how many know him? You've heard. I see a couple. That's good. See a couple of hands there. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is writing a book on education, and he's particularly talking about how do I prepare a baby boy for entering society at 25. Okay? What does that look like? How do we cultivate a self-governing citizen? Which is our outcomes, okay, with responsibility, okay? Now, he goes through a few stages, and what I call the running stage. I'm not talking about the dunking stage. That's where he takes a baby and baptizes them in the river Styx, right? Like in the classics, you just baptize your baby, right, in the river, and then you move on. That's like the 0-1 stage. And then, you hit the running stage, which gets all about the fact that you need to let your kiddos out, let them have recess. There's something about play for children that's really important for their development, and particularly even classical development, right? So the running stage, and that's where Achilles is being taught by Chiron, right? How to hunt, how to blah, blah, blah. And these images are in the book, Rousseau's Emile. Move on to science, which you notice Hermes studying geometry and learning all about science and knowledge, right? So we're almost kind of hitting middle school, if you will. And then you hit the worship of the gods. You have to learn what is theology. You have to learn how to encounter and begin to ask the big questions of life: origin, identity, meaning, morality, destiny, etc., right? Those sorts of questions, okay? The big questions of life, and that's arguably done on the high school level, but you're beginning to cultivate it in the middle school level. Do you guys do Socratic circles by chance? Anybody? Socratic circles? Okay, yeah. So some of the best Socratic circles I've encountered are middle schoolers. They're awesome at discussion. They do a great job, right? And they raise some really hard questions, right? And then romance, of course, and we start at, there's a cultivation of that too, but that's literally the stage where you're getting ready to get married, and at 25, you start the whole cycle again, right? Have babies and et cetera, and that's society. So you've moved from a single individual person to self-governing citizen. Right? So it's a very nice little book that way, and it's kind of broken up in those stages. But he argues in the first book that the greatest book on education ever written is Plato's Republic. And then he's trying to my book too, right? That's it. So check it out. C.S. Lewis. That would be the final, right? You guys have read probably Abolition of Man. Maybe you've read a handful of other ones. We heard Chronicles of Narnia this morning. But if you haven't read C.S. Lewis nonfiction, then you should, okay? His more adult nonfiction, more, if you will, apologetic works are very, very nice. Because here's the thing. He's a medieval literature scholar, and he's just really, really good with everything words, right? And so reading him, you kind of get blown open to all sorts of worlds. He has a way with words. I know we all recognize that, but he's excellent at what he does. And so in this little book, The Abolition of Man, which hopefully virtually everybody here and online have read or at least heard of. He has a little, he just talks about modern education, what's missing in modern education, much like a Dorothy Sayers approach to education. Okay, so now let's talk about some easier books, okay? Here we go, all right? So Dorothy Sayers, I just mentioned her. How many have read The Lost Tools of Learning? Lost Tools of Learning, okay? If you have not read, so everybody else in here who have not read Dorothy Sayers' Lost Tools of Learning, you need need to literally go Google it. You can even Google it now. I give you permission to Google it right now. It's about 10 pages, PDF, 30-minute lecture that she gave at Oxford one summer. It's very, very short, very easy, very, very, very small. And she's talking about exactly that, the lost tools of learning. And so she's going to talk about the trivium, the quadrivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric, etc., and how we've lost these little tiny tools, these huge tools that fundamentally transform your life when you're prolonged exposure to it. All right? And then, so read that one, please. Just get it done today. That way you've knocked it out. You've read it. It's really enjoyable. I'm not telling you just, it's not boring. It's enjoyable. Plato's Meno, anybody read Plato's Meno in here? Okay. Yep. Another dialogue form on what is virtue, can it be taught, etc. It is, 80 pages, something like that. No, not even. So it's very small. And then finally, a little book published by a Hillsdale professor. Hey, raise your hand if you've seen this before, The Great Tradition. Okay, all right. So you should now save up this month and purchase this off of Amazon and have it on your bookshelf at school or on your nightstand before you go to bed at night, and just read a paragraph out of it every now and then. It's an anthology of about 50 different authors throughout history, all on what it means to be an educated human being. It's an anthology. It's just a bunch of different original sourced, few pages from each author, and you read any of them. You read any paragraph. You might even read any sentence, and they're going to be quotable sentences for any of your classes on any level. Does that make sense? Yes. Oh, really? Okay, let me repeat that for the online students. A few of the books I've just mentioned are free on Audible. There we go. Good. I said that right. Audible, right? You said Audible. That's interesting. I didn't know that. Good to know. Great. So The Great Tradition, that's just another very nice, helpful. It's a tome. It's a big one, but it's very helpful, okay, for any level. What are we talking about when it comes to education? Okay? All right. There we go. And then finally, number 5, what's our time? 11:02, 10:02 El Paso time. What are the goals and outcomes of classical education? There are 3. Let me just hit them all. There we go. There are 3, and they aim at sort of head, chest, belly, classically speaking, intellect, virtue, the chest, seat of the strength, etc., and the belly, seat of the passions or the appetites. But the cultivation of the mind or the soul, right? I mentioned the soul already. If you don't believe in the soul, you're going to have a problem doing classical education, just FYI, right? You need to understand that there is a soul, there is a body, but I would submit there's also a soul, and most classical authors assume the existence of a soul, the metaphysical part of the human being in general, and so you're dealing with the soul, and the soul is just as complex as the body, but we typically refer to what you see on an MRI is your brain, not your mind. Right? When you go to have an MRI, that's your body. You don't get a picture of your mind. Okay? So your soul is the metaphysical part, and it's the thing that we're educating. In fact, many authors think of it as something you chisel, right? In education, you're starting to sculpt souls in your classrooms. That's what you're doing. Okay? Cultivation of the mind and soul, the formation of character and the heart. And I really want to make sure that character I think it's very helpful to think of character in the way that Heather Brown was talking about the moral imagination, the cultivation of the heart, right? We want to make sure to remember the heart of things, right? The heart of things. Those things that really matter in life, right? On all levels. And then finally, the training of body and really kind of the training for life just in general. Right? So never forget the body. Body's fundamentally important, and it really matters whether they're very tired, right? They're probably not going to be listening, or you're not really going to be doing too much to their souls at that point. Right? But play as well, sports, all of that. Right? Okay, so some good quotes. Here we go. We'll finish up with these things and hit responsive ed and be all done. The goal of education, per Socrates, the goal of education is to learn to love that which is worth loving. Now, I'm paraphrasing a little bit with the worth loving. He's saying the goal of education is to learn, or the goal of learning is to learn what is beautiful. But fundamentally and contextually, he is arguing the goal of education is to learn to love that which is worth loving. If it's not worth loving. And love means what I would cultivate a C.S. Lewis form of love, if you've read the Four Loves, okay? Affection, friendship, eros, marriage love. He says Venus love is sexual love. It's eros, which is marriage love. And El Paso Classical is, we read Four Loves this summer as our teacher development, so I'm preemptively striking here. But eros and then charity. And charity is really arguably one of the greatest forms of love, not only the love of another, but the love of God. And when you get into that book and that, like, what exactly is love, it's almost a drawing of the soul toward that which is good and true and beautiful, right? It's not necessarily a going after it. There's something about the nature of love in life that draws one toward the good, true, and beautiful. And so when we talk about what is worth loving, and even Socrates would be cultivating this, and Plato would be cultivating this view as well, but what exactly is love and what is worth loving? That's what we're about. That's what we need to be about. And honestly, that's what our schools are about. Okay, and then classic quote, if you ask what is the good of education, the answer is easy, that education makes good men, and that good men act nobly. We could stop there, but it's more fun to keep going. And conquer enemies in battle, because they are good. Now, it's kind of interesting. I mean, that might be a little bit controversial. So we're producing soldiers, right? One of the outcomes of TEA is producing military readiness. I think it's wild to think about that, but I, for one, am very thankful for people who serve and who are veterans and who protect our freedoms and fight for freedom, etc. But oddly enough, that's what Plato is arguing here, is that's another outcome. But nonetheless, right, education makes good men, and good men act nobly. Aristotle, very similar, right? The aim of education is make the pupil like and dislike what we ought. That's very helpful as well, right? You're training those kiddos what they should like and what they shouldn't like, and they need to know the consequences of doing things that they shouldn't be doing. So it's okay for them to experience some pain and some pleasure in their actions and how they're going about in life, right? And then abolition of man, right? Classic quote out of there. The goal of education is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. And all he means there is, he's talking about the chest and the spiritedness, if you will. And he's just saying, we don't need to cut down all the passions in life, get rid of all the emotions. Honestly, we're not even talking about the chest in modern education. All we need to do is irrigate deserts. We need to cultivate a garden, which is in Four Loves. That's his analogy or metaphor for the soul. It's a garden. And in your garden, in every single one of your gardens, bad loves and good loves grow. And the only difference between a wild forest and a garden is a gardener. And so and that's kind of where he points to the will and a few other things, but your job in life is to weed your garden and to make sure the bad loves aren't growing, but the good loves are growing. Right? Okay. Why responsive ed? Well, pretty simple, and Heather Brown mentioned it already, moral and academic excellence, and you're going to get this throughout the conference, and it was awesome. She shared the mission statement as well, but responsive ed mission is to provide hope for students through educational options that promote a free society, and then and cultivating, again, a gardener analogy, cultivating moral and academic excellence. Here's Mike Terry. Where is he? When I need him. We believe that the end goal of public education in America is to form responsible citizens and virtuous people who are prepared to thrive. Classical schools take an approach to education characterized by traditional liberal arts and sciences, curriculum and pedagogy, and an orientation toward truth, beauty, and goodness that aims to cultivate wise and virtuous citizens. Okay? All exactly what we're talking about in classical education. So, what's so great about classical education? It's awesome, and it will change your life. I mean it. It will. And it does these things. These are some of the outcomes, right? This is what we're aiming at in terms of the old sense of the word aiming, the telos, right? What is the direction in life? That's what we've lost in modern life, by the way, is we no longer have a telos, an orienting thing, as opposed to, say, the medieval societies, etc., right? But we have a telos, and we aim at things, and those things orient everything. They are our North Star, right? They're our North Star. And if it's not in line with those, you probably shouldn't even be doing it or going after it. So back to the food analogy, and along with this transformational idea, look, you change your diet and you're going to change your life. You change the student's diet and you're going to change their lives. And they're kind of forced to be there. And it's just your job to feed them the right things, right? So you change their diet, you're going to change their life, and you're going to start producing self-governing, very capable, wholehearted human beings who are able to flourish, right? That is an outcome, a telos in life, is that we should flourish. There's something about when you see somebody who's not flourishing, there's something wrong about that, right? And so there seems to be the inherent sense in life that we should be flourishing. So what does that look like? And I think classical education aims at that. So there you go, Classical Education 101. Thank you, guys. Now, questions. We have a few more minutes, 3 more minutes. Any questions? More candy? Anybody? More candy? Yes? Yeah, so major philosophical frameworks going on here, okay? Rousseau and looking into the modern philosophers are, it's going to cultivate really another conversation, okay? There's a couple of reasons why I use Rousseau. One, it's the only book I know that talks about an intentional education and what it should be from 0 to 25 years old. Plato does 0 to like 70 in this book. Okay, I really don't know of another book, classically speaking, or even non-classically speaking, or even modern in like within the last 10, 30 years or whatever, that actually talk about how should you raise X human being for X outcomes at 25. I would probably disagree with at least 50% of what he says in this book. Okay, but what he's doing, I haven't seen anybody else do, and I think it's a very important question and paradigm to think about. Now, in other places, he cultivates a conversation about, I'll say this very broadly. He thinks the main problem with the world is civilization. So him writing a book about how to produce a civilized, self-governing person at 25 to get married, he's kind of like choking and gagging himself the whole time. Because he doesn't think it should be done in that sense. He thinks everything that's wrong with the world is all a result of civilization. This is honestly a lot like what Nietzsche says. I mean, he's arguing that the entire world up until his point is trash. It's gone. God is dead, right? And so this is the nature of the great conversation, though, is you really do have to learn how to think for yourself and be able to encounter authors. And arguably, some of the things Dr. Nason is raising in that question, those are things that I would say run antithetical to what we stand for in our schools today. All right? So I present it for kind of those reasons, but I also say that when you take a close look at what we're reading in our schools, you're going to find that very few authors 100% agree with each other. That shouldn't stop you from reading them, and it shouldn't stop you from actually discussing them. I mean, Aristotle argues that that's kind of the nature, that's the mark of an educated person, is that they can hold opposing viewpoints in their head at one time. Right? So it's a good thing. And when you read Rousseau, you encounter the rise of modernity and major shifts in thinking that then you have to ask, okay, what's coming before him? What is he speaking to? Why is he arguing those things? And you can go much more in depth. You can hit all the the secondary sources, go look at scholars and what they're arguing, etc. But that's kind of just how I would go about answering very lightly what you're asking. You've probably heard of the noble savage concept, right? That's around that time, and that's what we're starting to call it. How should we be thinking about humanity? Where do all these laws come from? Where does society come from? What should be society? You had a question, Dr. Moore? Yeah? Oh, thanks. Yeah. 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 Which is yes. Yeah. Right. Yeah, that I think. Let me say what's coming to mind, and then see if that's actually answering your question. Founders has a very nice emphasis on the founders, right? And we're not talking about like founders of history, like Romulus and Remus, right? We're more so talking about the founders of the United States of America, the people who drew up the Declaration and Constitution, et cetera, right? And so that's another one, very historical, but one can easily argue that that the Federalist Papers are classical texts. They have stood the test of time, and honestly, the Constitution is the oldest written national constitution in existence today. There's a few qualifiers, oldest written national, that you have to get into and parse apart. But there's something about what the founders are arguing for that is explicitly classical. And this, I'm going to pull from, who's the Lewis, spoke at ATI, Lewis guy, Dr. HBU, Dr. Marcos, thank you. You guys know him, you've heard him. Yeah, he's hysterical, I love the guy. Dr. Marcos, and he was talking about this as well, but it's very nice to be restated. You read the Federalist Papers, and you're going to get examples and references to all the classical books that I've just been talking about, right? And all they say is that they're just standing in a great tradition. Heck, Jefferson writes to his friend saying, "Look, we drew up the Declaration of Independence. Yes, one in terms of trying to represent the minds of our what we feel right now, what we think right now, what's our sentiment. But you should see that even in your own library, the Declaration of Independence represents a synopsis of every single other author that you have on your shelf. I'm not arguing anything new," he says. This is what they've been arguing this whole time, and we just think that Britain has moved away from that and started to treat us very poorly, and we kind of want to go back. We want to kind of reorient ourselves. So that's what Founders is starting to cultivate, even though politically it's extremely volatile. I just mean explosive in our day and age right now. But I just think it's a historical emphasis for particularly our politic. But it really just cultivates the great conversation that if you're doing classical education in any nation around the world, even if you are bringing in Eastern classics, which we tend to not in our Western world, if it's classical education, it tends not to be the Eastern classics. You're still going to have this great conversation, and it's centering around what's worth it in life. What's life supposed to look like? Okay, I know it's past time. You guys are totally free to go, but I'm happy to keep talking. Did that answer at all what you were asking? Yeah. 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 Right. Right. Yes. Yeah. 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 Yep. And this would be Classical Education 101. There are many wonderful flavors to the whole foods diet, okay? Even within a whole foods diet, there's wonderful different kinds of restaurants out there. And particularly what I'm trying to cultivate is what we're after here in Founders Classical. What's most helpful for teachers, beginning teachers, 0 to 5 years, etc., right? But Classical Education 101 can say that we can have a fight break out over what is the right kind of classical education and who are the right kinds of authors. And primarily an intellectual fight, and it would be a very robust wrestling match. Because when you dive into, and this is why I say, go Whole Foods, go read these authors for yourself and start to cultivate, is Rousseau saying anything worth reading? Is Plato saying anything worth reading? Right? Because when they pop up throughout, every 500 years or whatever, they're sometimes talking to each other, but most of the time they're wrestling with each other, overtly, very, very heavily, like, no, you are way off on this because this needs to happen. And so when you get an American education, which begs the question, it should be American. I really don't think we should be educating for British citizens in our schools. We probably don't need to educate for Jamaica. We don't educate for Antarctica. We might educate for space. That's a little bit different thing. That might be a colonization idea. But there's something about when we do education, it's helpful to have it local based, right? At the very least, by and large, nationally, but typically even better to go more local. Texas education is very different from North Carolina education, just FYI. And I think you can tweak and change education in different ways. Yeah. 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 Yes. 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 Right. Oh. So my general go-to kind of way of thinking about different methodologies is telling, asking, and coaching. It's Mortimer Adler. Go read the Idea Proposal. It's another tiny little book. I almost mentioned it. Some people like Mortimer Adler, some people don't. He's the revitalization classic, great books, traditions, etc. But telling, asking, and coaching. So you tell the student how to ride a bike, right? You then ask, go back and forth, you discuss, right, on how to ride a bike, and then you coach and you yell from afar, watch out for the tree, right, as they slam into the tree. It takes a lot longer than that. As I just discovered with my 5-year-old girl, it's been very helpful to have a balance bike for like 3 years, and now she just rode a bike, in like 10 seconds, But there was a long stage there where she was just practicing and learning and going all along. I think I would still hold with telling, asking, and coaching, but we can do it in many different ways of doing that. But here's what I've discovered. In most classical schools that I've encountered, even sometimes in founders schools, there's not so much discussion. Okay, so I tend to introduce a little thing called Sakai Circles by Matt Copeland. It's $4 off Amazon, really good, and you can start to apply even on the little kid level, and that just incorporates this. Okay, I am responsible to learn as well. I need to learn what the teacher is teaching, but I need to dive in myself, and the teacher kind of pulls out just a little bit and lets them learn, and in the process, the teacher discovers what they're about. But little adjustments like that at working in, but we're not huge on project-based education. Founders by and large tend to be lecture-based, but yeah. Oh, good. And I'll be done. Are you up next?
We have virtual listeners, so this way they can hear the question.
Good, that's great, yeah.
Okay, so just the second part to that question is, I also love memory work, right? Which is typically heavily seen at the grammar stage, but again, is important across the grade levels.
Yeah.
And so bringing that into Founders specifically with our K-5 how, what, when, who, like that training so that we're not missing out on that. But I don't want to take away from the fact that a student can enter into our form of classical education at 7th grade, 9th grade, 11th grade, and still be wonderfully blessed by the classical education that they're exposed to. But what are your thoughts on memory work?
Needed, and I should have hit upon it because it's absolutely crucial part of education. It's kind of in the lecturing part, but it's just where you have to take something and just simply learn it, right? It's not up for discussion. You have to learn it. Here it is, know it by Friday, right? Or here it is, we're going to now say it back and forth, and we're going to sing songs about it, and we're going to do all sorts of things, and then you're going to have a recital at the end of the month. And that's going to be awesome, because that's just another immersion and a way to sculpt souls, right, in education, especially on the lower, but all through, right? We have an emphasis on that in the sciences today, where you just, you go off to med school, and you're actually just going to have to memorize. And you're going to actually have to answer questions A through M and actually know exactly which one it is. But that would be one element. But I think you're raising another element that happens all the time at public charter schools where it's open enrollment. We have kids coming in at every single level all the time and at all points during a semester too. And so it's not like the ideal where they started in kindergarten and worked all the way up through the whole program. We have to somehow ad-lib, right, and be prepared to prepare them for any level entrance. And that's really, really hard to do. But that's what's so cool about responsive ed and founders is they're actually starting to do it. And I haven't seen that effort or that kind of methodology really done really anywhere else. And I've seen a few different kinds of education. I'm going to mention, I think they're doing a great job. I need to wrap up. I think the next speaker, so I took way too much time. Thank you all. We'll see you around. Tom, come back to my, same thing tomorrow.